My name is Lillian Hart, 30 years old, trauma surgeon in New York City. The pasta hit my face like a burning slap. Scalding marinara dripped from my hair, splashing down my white blazer, right in the middle of my mother's lavish birthday gala at our family's luxury hotel. My brother Brandon stood there, holding the empty silver serving dish like a trophy. The entire ballroom fell silent. "You're done here," he snarled loud enough for every guest to hear. "You're dead to this family." My mother, Carmen Hart, didn't say a word. She just sipped her champagne, eyes cold, enjoying the spectacle. My father, Marcus, stared at me the way people look at stains on expensive carpets. My little sister, Ariana, burst into mocking laughter, like this was the entertainment she'd been waiting for. I blinked the sauce out of my eyes, heart pounding. Humiliation burned hotter than the food sliding down my cheeks. I reached for my purse. Every step, I could feel their eyes drilling into me. My voice came out like ice. "All right. If that's how you want to play this." I pulled out a sealed leather folder and slammed it on the table. The thud echoed through the ballroom, silencing even the murmurs. If I'm dead to this family? My glare cut straight through Brandon's fake smirk. "Then your empire dies with me," a few guests gasped. Phones came out. Recordings started. My dad barked, "What the hell is that?" "Proof," I said calmly, "that everything you own," I tapped the folder, "belongs to me, because this story is only just beginning. Stick around. It gets uglier." I was born into the Hart dynasty, owners of skyscraper hotels from Manhattan to Miami. Crystal chandeliers, rooftop pools, luxury spas. Our brand screamed wealth and perfection. Except inside our home, it was a rotting throne. Brandon, the golden heir, was always first. Groomed to take over. Spoiled until the world bent for him. Ariana, the princess, got the rest. Cars on birthdays. Fashion shows. Private boarding school in Switzerland. And me? I was the spare part. The background character. The one who didn't matter. Unless they needed a good PR photo. My childhood memories smelled of expensive perfume and emotional neglect. Mom would ruffle Brandon's hair and say, "My future CEO." She'd smother Ariana with kisses. My perfect little star. Then she'd look at me, straight A's, science awards, scholarships, and sigh, "Lillian, you really need to try harder to be likable." Dad rarely spoke to me unless it was criticism disguised as advice. Medicine is not glamorous. Hotels are. Don't embarrass us with your career choices, so I left. Spent years in scrubs, blood up to my elbows, saving lives in crowded trauma bays. No family visits. No support. No love, but one person always believed in me. Grandfather Victor Hart, the man who built the empire. He wasn't fooled by Brandon's charm or Ariana's theatrics. He saw through their entitlement. "You have drive, Lillian," he'd say in private. "They have hunger only for luxuries. You have hunger for purpose." He taught me investments. Signed birthday cards with checks that paid for textbooks. Whispered his hopes, one day, "You will run this family and fix what's broken." He spent his final years in a penthouse suite, alone. My parents were too busy. Brandon and Ariana, even busier. I visited every week. The night before he died, he squeezed my hand. "Promise me." "Don't let the leeches win," I promised. And he kept his own promise too. Because when the will was read, everyone expected Brandon to walk away with the crown. Instead, the Hart hotels, resorts, assets, trust funds, every single share went to me. Explicit condition. The heirs who abandoned him were cut out completely. Brandon lost his inheritance. Ariana lost her future fame budget. Mom lost control. Dad lost his golden successor narrative. They found out months later, and they were furious. For 3 months, they avoided me like a disease until last week. A text from Mom. Family dinner. Mandatory. Then Brandon. "We need to talk about Grandpa's estate." And Ariana. We should all celebrate Mom together. Fake. Every word. Then a final message from Dad. Be on time. So tonight I drove 3 hours after my 12-hour hospital shift, stupidly hoping they wanted peace. Instead, Brandon greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You're late, he sneered. You owe us an explanation. Guests circled like sharks. I felt the trap tightening. Dinner came. Toast came. Fake compliments and staged laughter. I lifted a fork, and boom, pasta. Splattered across my face like they'd been waiting. Dead to this family, Brandon announced. Mom clinked her glass. Ariana folded her arms smugly. Dad pointed to the exit. Get out. But they made one fatal mistake. They forgot that I always show up with receipts. That folder on the table? Inside were the notarized will, the trust fund schedule, the shares certificate with my name, the legal clause that destroys anyone who challenges it, and one more thing. The part they feared most. The Heart Empire wasn't just given to me. I secured something bigger. Something they can't come back from. And when I open that folder, they won't just lose the hotel empire. They'll lose everything. Their homes. Their reputations. Their identities, because while they were busy throwing food at me, I was quietly becoming their worst nightmare. When Brandon flung that bowl, when marinara ran down my cheek and the chandelier reflected 1,000 tiny judgments, I wasn't thinking about drama or headlines. I was thinking about timing. The leather folder on the table wasn't a prop. It was a carefully constructed chain reaction, and I had lit the first fuse. They expected a public meltdown. They expected tears or groveling or a frantic plea to keep up appearances. Instead, I sat very still, letting sauce steam down my neck while their whispers filled the ballroom. I let them savor their performance. After the guests left, after the embarrassed handshakes and the pitying glances, I walked them through the evidence. I let the lawyer explain the clauses, the notarizations, the dates. The trust my grandfather set up had a simple, merciless clause. Beneficiaries who showed willful abandonment in the last 3 years were excluded. He'd defined willful abandonment with precise legal language: missed visits, ignored medical contacts, failure to respond to written notices. They had done all of those things, and Grandpa had documented it in letters and timestamps. He had built a record quietly of who had truly been there. Brandon's face burned as the lawyer read the side letters, copies of emails where he'd canceled visits, text threads showing missed calls, security camera timestamps from the penthouse showing empty hallways. Ariana's glossy smile cracked when a nurse testified under oath about canceled visits. Carmen's practiced composure faltered when a hand-signed birthday card surfaced with a check tucked inside, endorsed and cashed by a bank account my grandfather controlled, paid to me for my tuition, while her name was missing from other years. They tried to yell. They tried to threaten legal contests. They accused me of manipulation. But Grandpa had foreseen this. He'd included a no-contest clause that stripped any challenger of their claim entirely and made them liable for opposing legal fees. He'd also set up a secondary mechanism, a promissory note and a buyback clause that gave me leverage over key assets if certain covenants were broken. It was ruthless, brilliant, and delivered in a voice that sounded like my grandfather's. Calm, precise, final. We moved slowly. I didn't want the spectacle of an immediate courtroom meltdown. I wanted the slow erosion. I wanted them to drown in the day-to-day collapse of the life they'd built on borrowed pride. So my first step was housekeeping, not headlines. I changed the locks on the family offices. I placed my name on corporate signatories. I quietly called the hotel CFO and asked for interim operational reports. I instructed the legal team to audit vendor agreements. Then I watched, letting anxiety thread into every corner of their gilded life. Brandon's investors started getting calls. We're reviewing governance, I told them, using corporate jargon like a scalpel. I was professional, cool, and utterly implacable. Until our audit concludes, we need temporary freezes on any significant transfers. That same night, I sent a curt email to the operations manager. Please halt any discretionary spending above $10,000 pending board review. Within 48 hours, small luxuries stopped arriving. No more last-minute private jets. No overnight room upgrades, no extravagant vendor payments. The folks who depended on quick cash began sweating. Ariana's brand deals dried up when her PR manager found an unsigned contract and a bank statement showing the agency had not been paid for months. The influencer firms called to cancel, citing unstable financial stewardship. She sat on the sofa. Instagram opened to draft posts that would never run. And I watched a person used to attention learn the sharp edges of consequence. At first, they blamed everything on accounting errors or miscommunication. I smiled, let them flail publicly while I kept working quietly. The board called for an emergency meeting. I joined by video call in the suit I'd kept for weddings and funerals, my face still smudged with tomato in the memory of the gala. I presented with cold precision. Paper trail, bank reconciliations, missing invoices, potential liabilities. The room that had always applauded Brandon's charisma turned into a jury room. Rumors spread. Staff who used to smile nervously in the corridors now spoke up. We weren't paid this month, one manager admitted. An HR memo revealed that payroll had been delayed because of an overdraft on an account Dad had used for personal expenses. A vendor called to say the French linen supplier was refusing to ship without upfront cash. Sponsors delayed sponsorship checks. The hotel's rooftop soirees, the Instagrammable events that kept the brand sparkling, began to be canceled because the PR team couldn't secure service deposits. One by one, the warm glow of the Heart name dimmed. Meanwhile, I didn't gloat. I set up a scholarship in Grandpa's name, hired back key employees who had been let go, and ensured the frontline staff, chefs, housekeepers, porters, were paid. The narrative shifted in small, powerful ways. Columns in industry blogs noted that the Heart brand was restructuring to protect workers, and a few sympathetic profiles traced the family drama to an honorable patriarch's last wish. I let those stories breathe. Public opinion is slow to move, but momentum is real once it shifts. At home, tension thickened. Carmen tried to call a meeting of socialites to smooth things over. Invitations were returned unopened. Dad's old friends from the construction deals began to distance themselves, their texts increasingly formal. Brandon started to argue more, shouting in rooms where previously he'd laughed. Ariana began taking long walks and longer, emptier nights online. I started getting messages from my mother's friend circles, petitions to step down, suggestions that someone else take temporary control. In private, I negotiated to keep the hotel's operational and debt payments current, but I also enforced consequences that used capital as a classroom. Then the first small domino fell, a lien noticed by a boutique lender. I had authorized it quietly after discovering a string of unpaid taxes attached to one of the landmark properties. The lien triggered an aggressive collection action by a firm that wasn't interested in press conferences. They wanted cash. That made the board nervous. The CFO explained that the company had been living on flexible credit and creative accounting, tactics that flattered cash flow until a firm, public audit demanded realism. When the news hit the papers, an innocuous line in a hospitality trade newsletter about financial review and governance shakeup, it blew up on lifestyle feeds. Bloggers who had fawned over my sister's gowns started rereading old stories and noticed inconsistencies. The social media whispers turned into threads about nepotism, too big to fail arrogance, and the human cost of dynastic wealth. The narrative framed the Heart Empire as not only wealthy but fragile. I watched them try to fight. They hired expensive counsel. Brandon staged a press release promising to cooperate fully, but his speeches read hollow because he'd always been about style over substance. Ariana posted a tearful reel about family and forgiveness, but the comments under the video told a different story. People began to question. The hotels lost a conference client, then another. A columnist I respected published a piece about stewardship and legacy, quoting my grandfather's handwritten admonition about caring for people over profit. The slow unraveling is far crueler than a single dramatic blow. It makes smiles strain and alliances shift. It steals dignity day by day. Dad, who once barked orders and drowned the house in expensive cigars, found himself negotiating payment plans with contractors. Brandon had to sit in budget meetings and actually read balance sheets. Ariana, who'd always had stylists plan every outfit, now shopped the clearance racks. By the time they threatened litigation, the no contest clause in Grandpa's trust had already done its work. Litigation takes months and money, and they had neither in abundance. When they filed, our legal team countered with a motion citing the clause and the explicit documented evidence of abandonment. I wasn't the vengeful daughter theatrically gloating on stage. I was the steward of an empire and the executor of a man's last wishes. That reality reshaped courtrooms and sympathy alike. I watched every step with a surgical mind, measuring, precise, patient. I never wanted them to see me as cruel. I wanted them to see themselves and to be forced to reckon with that reflection. Their world, so carefully crafted to hide the cracks, began to accept that staying beautiful required honesty they had refused to learn. They had called me dead to the family. The life they'd built around that lie started collapsing, quietly and inevitably, until their faces showed the exhaustion of people who had believed they were invincible and discovered they were not. When the first auction notice arrived for a Tropic Street property, a neighbor called to gloat. But even then I didn't dance on their ruin. I arranged for the property to be bought back by a charity I set up in my grandfather's name, preserving jobs and protecting the brand's long-term value. I wanted reconstruction, not catastrophe. Revenge in my grandfather's vision, and now mine, was not about ruin for pleasure. It was accountability with restoration. They watched as the empire remade itself under my steady hand. And while they seethed, the public narrative shifted. The Hart name began to stand for something different. Resilience, care, and the quiet competence of a surgeon who knew how to save lives and institutions. They thought the worst was over when the board vote passed to keep the hotels open, and the stories in the papers framed it as a stewardship transition. They were wrong. The real damage didn't come from headlines or a single auction notice. It came from the way fear spreads inside a house when the people who are supposed to be anchors become frantic, petty, and suspicious of one another. Brandon started making mistakes. He'd always been a man of performance, pitch decks, charisma, late-night charm. But under pressure, his sentences shortened, his promises ballooned. He began calling vendors and promising payments he couldn't authorize, scrambling to recreate an image that no longer matched the accounts. Once, during a budget meeting, he barked a number that was off by $3 million. A room full of accountants stared at him like he'd confessed a crime. His face went white. His hands trembled in public for the first time in his life. That tremor spread to everyone who had built their lives around his certainty. Ariana collapsed into 2-a-day coffee shifts and frantic DMs with brand managers begging for extensions. Her friend group shuffled away as cancellation after cancellation hit her calendar. The stylist who used to book her months ahead suddenly asked for deposits. She tried to stage a charity gala to prove there was still sparkle in the Hart name, but vendors refused to extend credit. On stage, under camera lights, she smiled like she always did. But her eyes darted to messages behind the curtain, text after text about bounced checks and contractual penalties. At home, the tension was volcanic. Dinner conversations devolved from barbs into lawyering. Marcus paced the marble floors like a caged animal, muttering to friends and calling old contractors for favors that never came. Carmen's social calendar, once immaculate with luncheons and galas, filled with curt RSVP declines. She began to speak in smaller, flatter sentences, as if the words themselves might betray her again. They turned on each other because it's easier than facing the truth. Brandon accused Dad of careless spending. Dad accused Brandon of incompetence. Carmen blamed me in private. calling at odd hours to beg me to fix things quietly. I let her talk, let her say the words. That had always been there, resentment couched as worry, so that the sound of them could sink into the empty places where empathy should have been. The biggest fracture came when one of their oldest allies, a longtime investor who had always loved the Heart brand, quietly withdrew a line of credit. He didn't send a dramatic email. He sent a single terse message to the board chairman that read, "We need clarity on governance. Until then, no more advances." That single pull tightened the noose on operations. Payroll delays became more pronounced. Vendors demanded cash on delivery, and a small maintenance backlog mushroomed into a visible problem. Guests posted photos of a fountain out of order, staff shortages at the spa, and a canceled rooftop event. The Heart hotels began to look ordinary. Ordinary kills luxury's mystique faster than any scandal. When creditors smelled weakness, they came like wolves. One supplier filed a lien. A boutique linen house stopped shipments. A catering firm put a hold on a major wedding. Some contracts included penalty clauses that triggered immediate cash demands. Inside the family, the recriminations grew vicious. Conversations turned into interrogations. Trust evaporated. Brandon tried to rally. He launched a PR offensive, drafted a video about family unity and honoring Victor's legacy. But the video looked staged. People sensed he was floundering. He began to reach for reckless solutions, riskier loans, high-interest bridge financing, a proposed merger with a private equity firm notorious for asset stripping. I stopped that quietly. I told the board the terms were dangerous and that accepting would strip long-term value from the properties. I offered an alternative, a temporary restructuring that preserved jobs and deferred some payments under strict oversight. The board voted for restraint. Brandon accused me of betrayal. His words were loud enough to echo down the halls, a confession of panic disguised as outrage. When desperation grows, it breeds bravado. Brandon did something reckless. He signed an unauthorized contract with a marketing firm that required immediate payment. The firm invoiced, then sent a notice, and finally threatened to suspend service. The hotel's loyalty program faced outages. Room bookings dipped. A large corporate client postponed a conference. Cash flow hiccups compounded each other until the CFO called an emergency meeting and announced that without immediate injections, some properties might have to be temporarily closed. Panic spread from the executive suites down to the housekeeping staff. People who had never felt the tremor of corporate instability now found themselves worrying about their paychecks. In private, they tried to bargain with me. Carmen visited my office under the guise of concern, tears in her eyes begging me to just give us a chance. She promised contrition, vowed to visit more. Her voice was small and sugary, the same melody she'd used for years to get what she wanted. For a moment, I almost felt something like pity. Then I remembered the nights she'd skipped at the hospital when I texted with a pulse monitor in my palm. I remembered Grandpa's hand trembling, and how my name had been on the deed instead of theirs because he knew who showed up. Brandon, tried more brazen measures. He started leaking stories to gossip columns, portraying me as a vengeful daughter who had stolen the company. He hired a tabloid-friendly spin doctor who began to push narratives about family infighting and a disgruntled outsider bent on destruction. For a week, the tabloids ran gossip pieces about the family. The public listened, but then the facts began to appear in more reputable corners. The notarized will, the documented visits, the no-contest clause. Once the facts landed, rumor evaporated like fog in sunlight. At home, paranoia turned to rage. One night, late and drunk, Brandon kicked a hole in the wall of the family office and then stomped through the gardens, cursing into the hedge. Ariana's friends stopped answering her calls. Marcus cornered a longtime family friend at a charity dinner and begged for help. His voice cracked. The man gave a curt handshake and walked away. They tried legal scorched earth tactics next. They filed motions that were expensive and conspicuous, legal threats designed to intimidate vendors and partners into holding back. I responded with paperwork, transparency, minutes, signed ledgers, and public records that exposed the truth. For every move they made, I had an answer grounded in documents. I didn't scream. I produced receipts. The courts look kindly on clarity and evidence. They look hungrily at chaos dressed up as bravado. Their friendships frayed. A cousin who'd always shown up for Thanksgiving surprisingly declined Christmas. Sponsors sent neutral notes. Even the hotel staff began to whisper that things were different now. The more the family lashed out, the more their isolation deepened. People who once smiled at their name declined to be photographed at their events. Small embarrassments multiplied into a compound. Humiliation they could not simply pay away. Then the most painful thing happened. An old family friend sent a letter to Marcus, suggesting he enter counseling and consider a public apology to restore trust. Marcus tore the letter up and threw it in the fireplace like a sacrament. Pride burned in that pile of ash. As their alliances crumbled, internal betrayal began to surface. One of Brandon's closest lieutenants, an operations director who had always been at Brandon's side, quietly forwarded contract records to our legal team after a whispered conversation in the kitchen. He'd been promised equity and a corner office, but when contracts went unpaid and bonuses stopped, he chose the side that offered stability. The staff watched the change like spectators at a match. Loyalty is transactional, and when resources dry up, transactions reverse. When a luxury suite under Brandon's personal control went into foreclosure due to a personal guarantee he'd taken, he finally understood what losing looked like. There were no dramatic scenes, just a quiet bank call, then a courier delivering documents. His face was blank. Ariana held him while he wept like a child who had lost a toy. They had never seen him break like that. I felt none of the gloating I expected. Grandpa had taught me something deeper than vengeance, stewardship. So I focused on the staff, on the hotel's reputation, on preserving the livelihoods of people who worked for a brand they loved. I negotiated payment plans for contractors, offered bridge loans to small suppliers through the philanthropic fund I created, and ensured payroll moved on time. Watching them flail, beg, and finally turn inward to fight for scraps of dignity was its own kind of closure. They had built their lives on appearances and hollow promises. As the empire's cracks widened, their world grew smaller, and isolation does things to people. It makes them honest, or it makes them bitter. For Brandon, it made him tremble in meetings. For Ariana, it made her Instagram posts hollow. For Marcus and Carmen, it turned gala halls into cold rooms where no one applauded. The house that once echoed with laughter now echoed with the sound of doors closing. In the silence after the storm, I kept a steady hand on the helm and let the consequences find their way to those who had earned them. They thought the hardest part was over when the board voted to keep the hotels running, and the headlines framed it as a responsible transition. They were wrong. The real finale wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a slow, precise series of legal and financial strikes that left them nowhere to hide. The morning the official audit report published, half the hospitality world woke up to a new narrative. The trade journals called it a governance failure remedied by decisive stewardship. The national press, always hungry for a human angle, led with photos of the Heart nameplate, and a subhead that quoted my grandfather, "Care for people, not just profit." The piece traced the chain of missed visits, the no contest clause, and the documented transfers. It didn't read like gossip. It read like evidence. They reacted with the theatrics they'd always known. Brandon staged press conferences trying the old charisma. He spoke about family values and internal disagreements, hoping to shrink the story back down to manageable scandal. Ariana did a staged live stream with tears and a rehearsed apology. Marcus and Carmen made a joint appearance at a charity brunch, flanked by PR consultants and carefully chosen friends. None of it moved the needle, because outside their rehearsed smiles, reality had teeth. Creditors moved first. A major lender, receiving the audit and the board minutes my team had quietly shared, issued a covenant breach notice. That meant emergency liquidity calls immediate demands for collateral, and the acceleration of certain loans tied to franchise agreements. The boutique lender who had filed the lien stepped up and filed a motion to foreclose on a property tied to an unsecured guarantee. The motions were clean, documented, and legally airtight, the kind of paperwork that leaves no room for Instagram spin. Court dates were set. Depositions occurred in rooms with lots of light and even more lawyers. I sat through them like I had sat through countless operations, methodical, calm, hands steady. I watched Brandon attempt to explain missed calls and canceled appointments, watched Ariana try to recall dates. Their voices wavered, their timelines contradicted emails and time-stamped visitor logs. Under oath, contradictions become knives. The biggest moment in court wasn't a dramatic soundbite. It was a folder no one expected to see, a set of handwritten notes from my grandfather discovered in a locked drawer and authenticated by forensic handwriting analysis. He'd annotated his own will with comments about stewardship and explicitly listed the behaviors that would disqualify heirs. In his voice, merciless and clear. The judge read an excerpt aloud, and the courtroom went quiet the way it does right before someone speaks the truth. When the judge ruled, it was with the heavy certainty of someone who'd read every line of the evidence. The ruling enforced the trust's no contest clause, dismissed several frivolous motions, and appointed a neutral trustee to oversee a restructuring plan. That ruling didn't demolish the Hart brand. It simply stripped the people who had abused it of control. The trustee, guided by my team's proposals, moved quickly to secure payroll, honor vendor agreements, and stabilize operations. The PR about stewardship moved from op-eds into action. Hotels that had faced cancellations now honored bookings, and the staff who had feared layoffs received reassurances backed by signed checks. Privately, the family unraveled. Brandon's best investors refused to fund further risk. Partners who had offered last-minute rescue plans demanded terms that would have mortgaged future revenues. A private equity firm that had once flirted with a buyout quietly withdrew. Ariana's brand deals collapsed under the weight of contract clauses triggered by the litigation. Friends stopped answering calls. Marcus paced luxury corridors that suddenly felt like a maze with no exit. There were quieter, more personal consequences that the tabloids never captured. Calls from old colleagues asking, gently, whether he needed help. A former protege declining a dinner invitation. A neighbor refusing to sign for a package. The cumulative effect of small rejections does what headlines can't. It shrinks a life from the inside. But there were also people who stepped forward in unexpected ways. Several longtime hotel employees testified on the record about my grandfather's kindness and my own efforts to protect staff pay and services. Their voices mattered more than any staged apology. A line cook's testimony about being paid on time under the new trustee helped a judge see that the transition served the greater good. Those testifying were ordinary people with ordinary stakes, and their testimony reframed the story from family melodrama to community protection. When the dust settled, the trustee offered an option I'd pushed for from the start. A chance for my parents and siblings to keep a dignified connection to the legacy without operational power. They could apply for non-executive roles, be part of a foundation arm, or simply step back with a stipend for living expenses tied to non-interference agreements. It was merciful, practical, and necessary. I wanted the estates preserved not for vengeance, but because wreckage does not honor my grandfather's memory. Predictably, they rejected the offer. Pride proved heavier than the truth. They threatened an appeal, hired new legal counsel, and retreated into their private rancor. Brandon took out a short-lived loan that collapsed within months. Ariana moved into a smaller apartment and started reapplying for gigs she'd once received without auditioning. Marcus and Carmen retreated to a quiet life that looked on paper comfortable, but it lacked the audience that had defined them. They were alive. They were less impressive. I did not relish their fall. I had sleepless nights like any human being watching people you once loved suffer, even when they had caused the harm. But there was satisfaction, quiet and disciplined, in seeing justice served in the way my grandfather would have wanted, not to humiliate for sport, but to write the ledger. With the corporate chaos contained, I turned to what actually mattered to me. The Heart Foundation launched with immediate focus. Full scholarships for hospitality students locally, emergency funds for laid-off staff, and an endowment for trauma center partnerships near our properties. I named it for Victor Hart. The first recipients were kids from neighborhoods that fed our hotels with talent and heart. Line cooks, housekeepers, bellmen. The Foundation's first press release emphasized stewardship, dignity, and rebuilding trust. It wasn't about headlines. It was about people. And then something unexpected happened. Months after the verdict, a letter arrived at my office. It was from my mother. No lawyers, no cameras, just 4 typed paragraphs. She apologized in a way I hadn't heard before, without qualifiers, without theatrical tears. She wrote about fear, about shame, about wanting to be better. She asked for no concessions, only one thing, a chance to volunteer with the Foundation, to see the reality of the hotels beyond the parties and the linens. I read the letter at my desk, fingers still warm from the printer paper. The impulse to throw it away was real. The weight of years of neglect and cruelty pressed against me. But my grandfather taught me stewardship. My patients often returned to me in later years grateful. Forgiveness did not erase the past, but it changed the future. I invited her to a Foundation orientation. She came quietly, unfamiliar with the rhythm of early morning staff briefings and the steady work of preserving livelihoods. Watching her fold linens in the staff room, awkward and earnest, felt like a small miracle. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase what she had been. It began to build something new. Brandon never wrote. Ariana sent a text that said simply, "I'm trying." I replied, "That's all anyone can do." The hotel stabilized under competent governance and a new board that included community representatives. The Hart brand slowly regained trust because the work on the ground mattered more than any headline. Staff who had feared for their jobs now had better training, clearer contracts, and a fund for emergencies. The brand's social feeds shifted from gala shots to behind-the-scenes profiles of chefs and housekeepers, small human stories that resonated more deeply than any staged luxury ad. Years from that gala night when tomato sauce had streamed down my cheek and the ballroom had fallen silent, I walked through a lobby that felt different. Children from scholarship programs laughed by the fountain. A former line cook who had risked everything to testify now managed a banquet floor he loved. The Hart name had a new voice, steadier, humbler, and truer to my grandfather's original promise. I never forgot the burn of that first humiliation. I kept the leather folder in a locked drawer for a while, a relic of a war that had to be fought. But more than revenge, what I carried forward was a responsibility. To protect the many people who depended on institutions, to make sure that when power changes hands, it does so with care. One evening, standing at the hotel rooftop that once felt like a stage, I watched the city lights blink on. My hands were steady. The air smelled of salt and distant traffic. The fight had been sharp and public, but it had ended not in spectacle, but in the quiet work of rebuilding. That, in the end, was the victory my grandfather had wanted, and the one I had chosen.